Okay. Welcome, one and all, to yet another episode of WhickTV, a cross-ideological space where we come together to talk about issues both political and cultural, from the silly to the serious. And gang, we've got a show for you tonight. I think I've hit all the buttons. I think we're live on everything. Yes, we are. Just confirming. Tonight, we are going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You guys have maybe heard it referred to as DEI. This is something that comes up in academia a lot. It comes up in other fields. We've touched on it briefly before, but tonight I wanted to focus on it. We have one more guest who'll be here. Joe will get here when he gets here. We'll pull him in when he's here. But we're going to talk about what it is, what it's doing, why it's controversial, and if it's fulfilling the purpose that it says it wants to fulfill. We're going to talk about it. It's going to be great. We got some great guests lined up, and let's get into it. We're going to start off with no stranger to the show, Tyler, average debate enjoyer. Go ahead. Give us what you got.
Hey, what's up, chat? 90% of the time where I'm at when I'm here. I am probably going to be leaning more in the defense of DEI. I think that its fundamental roots are good and good things result from them. The problem is a lot of it has been muddied and co-opted by racial identitarians and gender-bending leftists to turn it into a movement that does some not so good things. So a lot of the anecdote the other side of the conversation points out in modern day, I'm probably going to give them. But I think at the end of the day, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay, well, thank you for being here, and we will get into it as we go. Next up, first time guest on my show, Castle. What do you have? Who are you? What do you do? And what do you think about this subject? Go ahead.
Yeah, first time on, so appreciate you, Wick. Any other panelists here? Really nice to meet you guys. First debate ever. So hopefully this I won't shit the bed here. But I think that in terms of where I am and what I do, I'm based in New York. I do have a day job, which means that I can't do as much research as I would like to on some of these topics based on how things are always changing in the news. And I know, Wick, you mentioned the NPR stuff earlier, so I'll try to do my best here. But yeah, you can catch me streaming. I've been making some YouTube stuff under the handle Castle Guard, and I'm sure Wick, you'll let the folks know at the end. But basically, I wanted to get into similar to what Average Debate Jor was saying too, is like DEI. I think it's a net good. I think I would also start to argue the positives of it too, and how it's done more good than harm. Obviously, it's controversial, especially now, and how we've seen DI being used similarly to how CRT was used, kind of against folks of color and minorities to kind of pitch a wedge against people on the left and right. But overall, I think DEI is a net benefit. You kind of mentioned before throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think anytime you have social progress, you want to keep it going, even if it's too much, and then you can dial it back. So I think that's where I stand on this issue. Are there issues with it? Sure, but I think overall it's a net good.
Okay, well, thank you for being here. We will get into it as we go. Last, but certainly not least, until Joe gets here at least, we have David Cray, or is it Cree or Cray?
Yeah, great.
Cray. David Cray, please. Who are you? What do you do? What are your thoughts? Go ahead.
Oh, I turned that off. And it's still a marker. Excuse me. Sorry. Yeah, I am a writer, filmmaker, general troublemaker, and a mouthy person on the internet sometimes. So I am on the other side of the divide here. I'm very critical of DEI and the structure and apparatus around it, as well as the critical race theory movement. So I'll kind of be taking up that tack. You guys go easy on me for where you guys got the tag team over there.
It's okay. Well, thank you for being here. Thanks for introducing yourselves.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Let's just start off with talking about what it is. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. What does that mean? When people say that, what are they talking about? Why is this even in the news right now? Why are we even discussing this? Go ahead. It's open discussion. Feel free.
Diversity is a group of different people that come together generally. Equity is kind of taking some from the top to give to the bottom, more of an economic term than anything. And inclusion means bringing people from outside the fold in. And I think all three of these are American values and manifest in policy that generally has great approval rating on both sides of the aisle.
I think that's true, and I think those are all positives. I just don't know if that's entirely what EI is about. I think it claims to do those things, and but goes about them in ways that maybe aren't so constructive. Maybe they were at one point. I think Tyler, you mentioned that briefly before we started it, but um, you know, it's there are three terms, there are three words, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, but it's also a movement or a continuum, right? It's a label, a slogan that's put on. Talk about like DEI departments and or a DEI officer in a company or a DEI a person at a university. So it's more than just I think three words that we can just simply define. There's a broader political connotation to the DEI as a thing, right? As its own thing. And I see it as a product. I see it as sort of the implementation of the critical race theory movement. I see those as that as an arm of that, as a continuum. So that's
Any
kind of my concept of it.
when you talk about it as being like a program, how does this manifest in your opinion, right? Like, where do they apply it? Is it something that is, for example, um, is this something you'd see at a normal 9 to 5 workplace, or is it only in academia? Who is using this term and how are they using it? I guess would be the question, right? This program, I should say.
I'd say it's definitely in the workplace. It's DEI officers or DEI executives at major corporations. It's in academia as well. Like I think there've been a number of articles in this last few months or last year or so about like different universities showing how bloated these departments, these DEI positions are. Like they're spending tens of millions of dollars employing people to do DEI at the institutional level in academia. What they actually do is a good question. Um, but it certainly exists not just in academia. But I mean, you'll see it. I was surfing through surfing through LinkedIn for work, trying to find who to talk to at certain companies for certain things, and just kept running into um, you know a DEI officer or diversity executive. I'm the director of this, and so it's a title, it's a job title, it's an official thing, and their job, as I understand it, is to implement these ideas, these programs, trainings. They have a lot of they talk about diversity trainings, and that's a topic something we touch on, and question of how effective that is. And so there's a full apparatus. It's become a very large bureaucracy, and I think it's in the billions of dollars as a kind of a cottage industry in the corporate side, and it's not just in the United States. This is something that's spread to Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. A lot of European countries are dealing with it now. So it's kind of I think it's a movement that's has its arms and its prongs.
Yeah.
If that's
I
one
was-
way
Tentacles
of looking at it.
expanding. Go ahead, Castle. And then after you're done, hopefully
yeah.
once Joe gets his camera set up, we can give him his brief intro. But go ahead, Castle.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it sounds like based on what Tyler and you, David, were talking about the core tenets of DEI, like we don't disagree that DEI is bad. I think we're disagreeing on where it's going or how you feel like it's been going and progressing through society, and maybe I don't know what your time frame is, maybe like the last 5 years or post-COVID, pre-COVID, whenever it started, in your mind. But so I think like in terms of DEI, we agree that that stuff is good to promote, but the way it's been promoted, we may have disagreements on, which is totally cool with me. I think, if you want to talk about companies or schools or government institutions that have these kind of like bloated money laundering positions of people just taking money just to tell people not to be racist and say the N word, that's totally fine with me. I think that's also kind of a way. I don't think those things have ever worked, in my opinion. But I think when I think of DEI in terms of the good, like, for example, like affirmative action, that's something that you could possibly say it was DEI, right? You're taking a portion of the population that was discriminated against and weren't let into schools, even for certain schools back in the 1950s and before, and allowing them to attend schools and universities. I mean, we know about historically black colleges that were created because they weren't let into white universities. So, like, something like that, I think we could agree is good. Now, obviously, we know the Supreme Court had recently ruled on affirmative action, and how schools are going to try to weave their way in and out. I think it will kind of exist in the background, just in different ways. But I think something like that has helped uh, society, at least in the U.S., and has promoted in a way where back then I think a lot of people may have been seeing it and viewing it as how DI is viewed right now in this moment where it's too extreme, and giving maybe minorities and others an edge in some cases. Like you could view DEI as saying like, well, just because I'm white doesn't mean I shouldn't get this job if we're both have the same skill set or so on. So I think, and we'll definitely talk about this more, but I think that's where I just wanted to kind of see where the conversation could go.
You do have a point there, and a lot of. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, introduce Joe.
It's fine. So $2 from Testicle Johnson to say, as a minority, I support DEI because it benefits me. Thank you for the $2. Joe, are you with us yet? Are you set up?
Yeah, how's it going, fam? I might sound incredibly digitalized than how I usually am. Turns out the work meeting I had down here lasted longer, so I'm coming to you live from Maryland, but my phone's not cooperating with my phone camera, so
You
there's
know
probably
what?
just a Discord.
The voice is fine for now. What are your thoughts on this, right? Like, so we're talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion today. What is it in your opinion? Do you support it? Are you against it? Why or why not? Go ahead, give us what you got.
Yeah, and thanks again for having me. I know it's been a long time coming. Very generally, the first question that I kind of always ask about these initiatives, whatever it is substantively, is what is the goal that this thing is trying to do? And being able to have institutions articulate what that goal is an incredibly important part of the academic process. If we're talking about whether it be in academia, if we're talking about within the workplace, or even the workplace of academia, as an example of how those two things can kind of cross with each other, is an important thing. With that being said, I'm very concerned at the lack of specificity and the lack of transparency that I'll use colleges and universities as an example of how they want to act out and implement these things in a way so that casual consumers, in this case, I'm talking about student bodies, the passive person who is contributing to the educational process. That could be somebody who's literally paying their taxes so that the school can be up running, or even something more abstract of being a donor to an institution like a college, of like understanding what these things are. And I think this is a problem not only in academia, but also in the workforce. And there's a bunch of reasons about that legally that I don't quite care about getting into. Because obviously there's different privacy concerns and different sort of terms and conditions that these institutions, whether it be a workplace or otherwise, sign up for. So NDAs exist. However, I think it is fair for them to be on top of the communication process, which I don't think was met. With that being said, I think the goals, from what I was able to get from different DEI officers and being engaged in the field myself from, I think it's a just cause. If we're trying to create a more inclusive environment for people of different backgrounds that are outside of the institution, whether that be a college or a school or a workplace's hegemon, and that hegemon is going to be different where you find itself, I think it's a just cause. My concern is that when you are finally actualizing these things, what is the substance of what we're talking about? So I'll give a very brief example and I'll get back to the floor. If you're looking to make sure that you have a diverse set of individuals, what are the aspects of diversity that you're looking for? Because if you're only looking for the superficial aspect of what this appears to be, then I have concerns. If you are looking for what this is in terms of content and substantive content to your goal, that I think is something of value. So a way, and a very like, it's an abstract example, and maybe we can get the nuance of it later. But if you're looking to have a very justice-oriented mindset within your law department, then what does that look like substantively when you articulate that to the people that you're looking to hire? And how are you going about those goals? And these things should be transparent, not only to the applicants and the people working there, but also to the general public, to be able to look at these things objectively.
Okay. Thank you for being here. Appreciate you coming on your phone, man. I really do. Let's open it up back to the floor. He said a lot of
Do I
stuff.
sound like Hillary Clinton when she does her bomb strikes? Or
You're
is it coming
fine.
through
You're
clear?
fine.
So he has a couple of good points in there, and I kind of agreed with a few of what Joe was saying. First off, to David, I didn't mean to do the Mott and Bailey thing. I was just kind of giving a definition of the three words. You are right that the infrastructure built up around this now. I think Kessel used the
Yeah.
term money laundering. In a way, if you look at it, it really could be classified as that if you want to take a negative connotation toward. Yeah, a lot of grants go out from government and different private groups and Mark Zuckerberg's wife that go into funding people being able to hire DEI representatives to push this more modern version of DEI. That being said, I think if you look into these things, you can judge them by their strengths. Diversity, the big strength for that is we got to hear other perspectives, how to deal with different cultures, different outlooks on life, different perspectives, and that helped us alleviate racial tensions over the decade. Equity, on the other hand, something like the Pell Grant, it was an economic stance that poor people getting a little cut of the rich people's taxes would be good. What seems to have happened is we've bled the lines between the two, and now we're doing a form of racial equity by combining DE and I together to make like you've seen the 10-year-old arguments. It's a trope at this point, but like Oprah's children, if she had any, would be more oppressed than some kid from the poorest county in America in white Appalachia would be less oppressed than Oprah's children. And it's like a meme argument, but it does have some merit to it. That bleeding the lines between these things and combining them all into a similar strategy. The downside of it is racial polarization.
Let me try this. Let me try this. For the people on the kind of more pro side of DEI, can you give me an example of a company, university, organization, institution which has implemented DEI in a way you think is commendable and good and we should emulate? Go ahead.
Well, I don't have any specific university or company policy.
No
I just
specific.
well,
It doesn't have,
I
you don't
would
have to
point
articulate the
to
policy. Just point to the institution. Say, oh hey, at this college they did it well, or oh hey, in Google they implemented it well, or oh hey, at NPR they did it well or poorly, right? Like give us an example, please, that we can kind of work with.
I will just because I don't have specifics, will generalize that diverse hiring practices or having mentorship programs or resource groups or trainings for diverse applicants, I think has helped. Like in schools, learning about slavery, the Civil War. In Florida, I know they have a whole issue with elementary school education, what Rosa Parks did, what
Is
she
that
didn't do.
DEI?
Well, I'm just explaining the past and having that into educational universities or schools. I think that's part of implementing a certain curriculum that I think people would label as DEI. I think that's where you got into the whole CRT argument, especially in Florida with the school boards there, is they were saying that children were being taught to hate each other when it was just facts about slavery or the Civil War. And so I think implementing those, whether it's certain cultures that have been forgotten about, certain people's history that have been forgotten about, I think teaching about that is super important. And I think even in the workplace too, at least where I work, we have, Jewish coalitions, Black coalitions, Asian Pacific. They have different, days where they'll come in and talk about, issues or bring in food and all
Okay.
that stuff. So I think there are things that have been implemented in the past and today that I think have been helpful that kind of represents DEI.
Sure. Let's
I don't know what specific that is.
yeah, let's give it to the other side. Can you give us and we'll get to you in a minute, Tyler, I promise. But for David and Joe, can you give us examples of where it's been implemented, in your opinion, poorly? And again, more specific the better. So if you could point to an institution, a university, anything like that, right?
Yeah. Before we get there, I'd like to just address a point of Castle. You earlier was talking about how DEI and affirmative action, and I see those as two different things. I don't see that as DEI as the continuation of affirmative action. I think affirmative action it was beneficial. A lot of the programs it was more about opportunity, and whereas DEI is a different approach. I think there's been a shift, and also the question of diversity, right? Skin color and hemisphere. It seems to be the way we define that. Like you're white, you're black, or you're Asian, right? Because Asian's not a color, right? Or Latino, or I think part of what's missing in the DEI terminology, or the lexicon, or the way they conceptualize a lot of this stuff is culture. They lump people into these larger groups by color or by region, and sort of ignore the myriad cultures that exist, right? There's so many different people from so many different cultural backgrounds, and they just get lumped together in this kind of lazy concept of, well, you're with those people because you look like them, and you're like, and the person's like, what are you talking about? I'm not one of because people have very many different ethnic backgrounds, which are very distinctive cultures, and we kind of ignore that in this sort of in the DEI continuum in today's discussions, and I think it's so to get back to the question you asked about where is it being implemented badly. I mean, my view is it's being implemented badly pretty much everywhere, because they're pushing these sort of simplistic colorism, like that race is color or region, and the history of race and racism. We can't even really discuss it um, properly unless we acknowledge that people's concept of those things historically included ethnicity and nationality and tribal background and things like that. Like, not just this person's white, this person's black, this person's Asian or Latin. It's not that simple. In my view, that's a very sort of current day American centric concept of race and racism and discrimination, where historically, right, like lots of different people have been discriminated against, have been oppressed, come from oppressed backgrounds, and some of them happen to share the same skin color with people who maybe didn't. So to me, that's, I think, a fundamental problem with what's going on today is this kind of the simplistic, lazy conceptualization of groups and group identities.
Okay.
So yeah, so where is it being implemented badly? I think everywhere, especially where you've got tens of millions of dollars at universities. Like I think it was it University of Michigan? I think there was a report on that a while ago. They had like tens of millions being spent on diversity officers, and I'm looking at this list of all these administrators. Thinking, couldn't they give those to turn those into millions of dollars into scholarships for people from uh, communities that are that need those opportunities or could benefit?
I can.
Just seems to be just like a
'cause I
lot
have
of
an
money
answer to
being
that
blown out.
Yeah. Go ahead, Tyler, and I want to give the mic to Joe for a minute. Go
Yeah, I
ahead.
got to answer his question real quick, and then I got a bunch on what you actually were asking before. So the reason why is because a lot of those things come from grants, and maybe you could argue that with the government money that's going into these colleges, turning that into grants. But a lot of this money is coming in from private donors who are interested in pushing DEI. Like again, Mark Zuckerberg's wife is donating specifically so that colleges can hire administrators to do specifically that. So private funding is there for that, and it would be kind of shitty of them if they took the money and didn't do what they promised they would by when taking it. That all being said, you was asked about effective DEI policies, and I'd argue that that's the default. I'd argue that in the news, when we hear about Coca-Cola or people that hire Robin DiAngelo and for obscene amounts of money and have some woman come in and speak stupidity at them for 2 hours, those are the exceptions to the rule. And most of these Fortune 500 companies in the country, Ring Central, Slack, Chegg, Discord, these are all DEI companies. But see, that they're not doing the leftist racial DEI. If I'm looking at Ring Central right now, it was the top one on this list. They target military veterans, children with special needs, LGBTQ, people of all races, Latinx. I hate that term, but they're using. So they even reach out to groups that wouldn't traditionally be considered like oppressed minorities or things like. And they're trying to bring all those people up because they're recognizing the struggles you have when you have a son with special needs, let's say hypothetically. And so that is a good version of DEI. And I'd say again, if you look through these companies, for every Fortune 500 company has some sort of DEI and ESG thing, and has BlackRock investing in them. I don't like BlackRock, but I don't think it's for the reason that they're trying to push policies that generally are good, and again, 95% of the time fly under the radar.
I really got to respond, Wick, to that just real quick because
Quickly, and
I
then we do
feel
have to get
like,
Joe in. But quickly, go ahead.
well, I think this could head up to Joe too, but I think what Tyler said was great because, and I'm not saying David believes this, but when we say DEI, we're just saying black. We're not saying LGBT military veterans. If you said, hey, military veterans are getting help with DEI, people would love it. There would be there wouldn't be pushback for that. The reason it gets pushback is because it's just another word for a black person, and I think people are trying to use that as a cudgel. Obviously, I think other minority groups definitely are a part of it. Women can be included in that too, as just kind of like a minority. But I think when we really talk about and I think in this circle we're really not that far apart on the pros and cons, but there are conversations online when you mention DEI, it's just like this black pilot only got the job because she's a black woman, or this black guy is only working at Boeing because so and so. So like I think that's where maybe Boeing's a bad example, but I think that's where we I think that's where sometimes the conversation goes with DEI, and that's why I mentioned CRT earlier. Is like I think we're just really talking about black people here. So anyway, Joe can head in now.
Go. Thank you for the permission, Joe. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, there's some to that, right? I think for me, it's a matter of content over melanin, right? Where I think it's very easy for companies to do the bare minimum of we just need to make sure that certain racial demographics are represented visually in our company because there are profit motives, and it's very clear about that. They say it directly. Jared Ball, I might be misrepresenting a little bit of his argument, but Jared Ball, Dr. Jared Ball speaks to this very clearly about there is a profit margin to having physical representation of different minority groups, and that can't be ignored. However, when we want, again, what's the goal of us doing this thing so that it's better for the broader public when they engage with our whatever it might be? And that's where I'm skeptical about it. Where if I look at a place that's doing it successfully, to answer your question, Wick, it would be within the uncommitted movement in New Jersey. NJ Uncommitted, or Uncommitted NJ, is essentially a coalition of a bunch of different folks all advocating for uncommitted justice for Palestine to be on the ballot for our primaries. And they, at the point of us having this conversation, have enough signatures so that can be an official party on the ballot, also with the same font as the other presidential primary candidates. And that's a big deal. For a lot of other reasons about New Jersey politics I don't want to get into.
Sure.
With
But
that being
if
said,
I may, Joe, like, so you mentioned this as a successful implementation of DEI. How is this movement or whatever using DEI in a way that you would consider correct?
they're engaging with I'm gonna say all communities, but as many communities as possible where they're at. Because if you're looking to have a diverse environment of people, you're going to have to engage with those diverse environments genuinely. So if you are, for example, and I'll make it really simple, if you're looking to have more Black students enroll in your job or apply for your job, are you engaging with Black people substantively where they are within the community that you find yourself in? If you know that a large portion of your Black population or your Black workforce lives in a particular community and you don't do any advertisement, any engagement, any involvement in that community, it's unreasonable to think that you're going to have applicants apply for your position. If you're looking at from a matter of an organizational standpoint, if you are looking to have a diverse environment of political ideologies, as much as it wants, and I'll be very hyperbolic here, as much as it pains my heart, you're going to have to talk to people like 𝕾𝖍𝖎𝖙, because he is a diverse voice that you're looking for if you are trying to find a diverse set of individuals. But you need to engage genuinely within whatever community 𝕾𝖍𝖎𝖙 finds himself in. And that is saying that, hey, we are not, like, there is always going to be that underlying motive of trying to be like, we're here because we want you to do X, but you want to still not let that, whatever that bubbling is, be the only driving factor as to why you're there.
Okay.
So engaging with the community genuinely, engaging with the people genuinely. Does that make sense?
To me, how about the rest of you? You picking up what he's putting down or not?
I will not sit here and listen to this slander and malarkey about Lactoid. How dare you?
Okay. Well, 𝕾𝖍𝖎𝖙 can defend himself. He will, I'm sure, on another occasion. He's not here tonight. But David, you said something earlier that I want to interrogate a little bit. Because I'm very curious. You said that the CRT, or at least DEI, is kind of like the continuation or another version of CRT, or can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Implemented. I think it's being implemented using a lot of the ideas, concepts, and narratives that come from CRT. I think the people involved in DEI a lot of them come from a CRT background, and are pushing those narratives, those concepts of race, those concepts of what question, what do you mean by diversity, right? Castle, you're saying, well, by diversity we mean Black people. Was that a statement or was that sarcastic? I couldn't tell. Because is it right? Like, are these programs are we talking about affirmative action or a continuation of that for Black people in America, or are we talking about a movement, the DEI movement, which exists not only in the United States, but in all these other countries, Canada, UK, European countries are dealing with it now. And there was a story was it late 2020, like late last year, of a teacher in Toronto, Canada, who committed suicide after the DEI trainer was laying into him publicly, and saying, well, you're, basically, I can't remember exactly what was said, but the idea was, well, you're a white male, therefore, that kind of vibe, right? And I think he was in the middle of suing the school board over how reputational damage that had been done to him by this sort of very activist DEI consultant who had been brought in and paid a bunch of money to do these trainings. And a lot of them are pushing ideology rather than training people to be sensitive, rather than training people to be culturally competent, I think is a term they like to use, where I look at a lot of that and think, are they really teaching cultural competency, or are they teaching people to stereotype, right? And to make assumptions about who is oppressed and who isn't based on a lot of lazy categories. I think there's not a lot of nuance in a lot of the rhetoric. And I think that's I don't know if that kind of addresses your question. I feel like I kind of rambled there for a bit.
It's okay to ramble. We all ramble. That's fine. $10 for running joke. I'll use this opportunity to make a little money. Should diversity quotas apply to sports teams? NBA doesn't represent the racial demographic of America. Shouldn't the teams strive to be more racially inclusive for Asians and other minorities?
I can answer that.
That's silly.
Go ahead, Joe.
They already are doing these things. The problem is, much like other fields, you're going to have to engage with these communities genuinely. I'll give an example of the WNBA because it's a hot topic. The only way you're going to get people actually caring about the WNBA is that you have to treat women as an actual buying power within the WNBA, and you have to engage with women as a consumer where they're at. And currently, as it currently stands, they're trying and failing because they have not engaged with women as a cultural buying power within athletics. And that's going to be a long road. But what the task should be is like, how are women as consumers different in the sports environment, and how can we engage with them in a manner so that they are watching our activities, that they're actually engaging with the sport of women's basketball. Tying that into the NBA, sorry, the NFL, where if you don't have, like, which is why they have the player recruitment program of going overseas, reaching out to particular rugby players where they're at within their communities, and having different type of enrichment programs, whether it be directly through sponsorships of teams or within the NFL as a collective through things like the supplement draft, as an example.
Okay, and you wanted to say something? Go ahead, Tyler. You were trying to
Yeah,
get in there?
so yeah, I mean, I'm writing down responses, so I got one for everybody. So to address Joe real quick, well, I mean, more Wick's question, Joe, I can kind of go on with Joe here. That's already kind of happening with women's sports, absolutely. But the reason why this doesn't happen with sports in particular, and I'm not a huge fan of comparison policing without a good reason, I think this is a valid one, is the reason we watch sports is because we want to watch the top 0.1% of the upper echelon compete at the highest level. And the reason why diversity wouldn't work there is because diversity kind of runs counter to meritocracy to a certain degree. Now, to Kessel, you were saying that it kind of came off as a jab when you said when people say diversity, they mean black people. It kind of comes off as you're slightly kind of calling
Yeah,
everyone racist.
but just real quick, like, we've all seen this, and I'm sure we can all attest. Like, once the what is it, the bridge that got destroyed recently, that a cargo ship ran into
Francis
it.
Scott Key.
Thank you, the Francis Scott Key Bridge that collapsed. Um, I don't know if he was a current congressman, but someone who at least was running for
Current, yeah.
Congress claimed DEI was responsible. And when you see a plane crash things, when you'll have a black pilot, or they'll suggest that there might have been a black person involved, and so they'll use this term DEI. So, I mean, does anyone contest that fact that there are elements out there
Where
who are
they
simply
call
using it as a
they call the mayor a DEI mayor.
yeah,
The
just
black
as
mayor.
yeah, just
mean,
as a way, just
that's
as
what I'm
shorthand.
saying.
Like
I'm
I mean,
not
when-
denying it exists. I'm just saying when you
When-
call somebody that trying to make a good faith argument, it comes off as a jab, is all. And
Sure.
there are people that on the other side that tried to make it specifically a racial identitarian movement. So sometimes it is warranted to think that I was talking to Short Fat Otaku a little bit on Twitter about it really is kind of a zero-sum game with diversity. If you want to give position to some, like a position of mentorship to some, you're taking it away from potentially somebody else. It is kind of a zero-sum game at the end of the day. So there is going to be a little bit of racial animus if you overcorrect.
And I just need to say too, I didn't mean to imply like David thought that DEI meant like, or if he was racist. I think there are people who use that term and they are racist for sure. But I think no, David seems like a cool guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I didn't mean to use
Or
it
to
as
be
a
the
jab in
most
that
No,
way.
no,
charitable,
I
like
just
a racial
think that-
element involved.
Yeah. But I think well, Wick, am I good to
Just talk,
here?
man. This ain't school,
All right.
right? Like, if you guys get uppity or whatever, I'll make sure to moderate. But just have a
Thank you.
conversation, okay?
I wanted to bring up a point that Joe, I think, was making about the WNBA and how we're kind of supplementing women's basketball. And I think you could say that capitalism and the money is really a force behind DEI as well as a whole, not just in sports, but I think, when Tyler was talking about government grants or private donors, I think that this is helping kind of bring things to the forefront. And I know David's brought up some points about like there are some extremists out there. I know Tyler, you also mentioned Rama D'Angelo, where it's like sometimes the money falls into the hands of people who are spouting rhetoric that is unhelpful. And we're not talking about the good that has come out of it. And I think that's also hurtful to the conversation as well, where it's like there are a lot of good things, but then the people who are making the headlines are the crazy ones that even I think are doing harm to the movement that they're trying to say that they support. So I think that money is kind of following this initiative for people in the hopes that it starts to drive conversations for good. And then I think just because of some of the excess that's out there, it can fall into the wrong hands. But I just thought the capitalism argument could
Before we
might
go
show a
on,
statement.
sure. Before we go on, I have a few super chats I'll get to, and then we'll go into $5 from Ellen Degenerate. And I know you're backstage, dude, but this is a closed panel. We might have call-ins later. I understand. $5. Israel. Wow. People in New Jersey oppose our genocide. I guess we will stop now. Thanks, Joe Lewis. Thank you for the $5.
Let's talk Israel. Let's do it.
No, we're not. We're gonna stay on topic, stay on course. €5 from 𝕵𝖎𝖎98. Surveys have stated DEI initiatives often lead to more racial animosity. It just seems to me we are happy to tear the social fabric apart to look good. I want to ask David specifically. You talk a lot about how you've said a lot of things in a very general sense, how these things are being implemented poorly, that they're using cultural competency and these other terms that are not helpful and things like that. But at its core, looking for a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace, why is that wrong? Or is that wrong?
It depends on what you mean by diverse, equitable, and inclusive. We talked earlier about how affirmative action programs of the past, um, did a lot of good. It did to alleviate disparities, to help people who needed opportunities, or who didn't have a lot of opportunities. But um, again, when you're talking about diversity, what do we mean? Are we saying and why are we doing it? That's a question I've been wondering about. I remember, so I was in student government way back in the day, in the mid 1990s, when I was early mid 90s when I was undergrad, and the political cudgel of racist, sexist, homophobic was really popular among the campus activists at the time. And the administrators were tripping over themselves to prove, to show, to demonstrate just how not racist and not sexist, not homophobic they were. And so, of course, what do they know how to do? Create a committee, create positions, right? And we're gonna study it, and we're gonna have somebody, an officer and an administrator. They make more administrators to administrate these issues when they come up. So then when there's something does bubble up, or something happens, or there's an incident, they can say, this is the person to handle it. This to me is like passing the buck in some ways. Is like, look, we just, it's almost like painting the doorposts with the blood, so that the plague doesn't come get you. Like, you don't want the activists showing up at your door. So I think a lot of these companies and institutions may be motivated by more of a PR
Does that matter
reasoning.
at the end of the day? Like, for example, if I
Well, if
save
they're
a
just
kid from
creating-
if I may, if I save a kid from a well just because I want to look good, does it matter to that kid who got saved from the well, right? Like, so even if they're doing it for selfish reasons,
yeah.
so what if
creating a
they're still doing
diversity
well?
executive, did creating a diversity officer at the university or in the company save anyone from the well? Did it actually help anyone who's a minority or from a downtrodden community? I've said this before, that that a lot of this money, these tens of millions, hundreds of billions, actually, I think this is a multi-billion-dollar industry now. Could in the academic world, in like some universities are spending tens of millions of dollars. Would it not be better to take that money and give it to scholarships, to actually
But this
get
is the
people
reason that
educated,
the
as
money,
opposed to
as Tyler said, this is the reason they're getting the money. They're getting the money directly. The person giving them the money is saying, "Hey, I'm giving you this $10 million to set up these programs." It would be.
Are they though?
It
Are
would
they
be.
though to set up these bureaucracies, or are they saying we want to help actual people? Right? Like, I don't, or maybe these are just jobs that they want to give to people who got these useless CRT degrees.
Useless
Maybe
CRT degrees.
people
Okay,
who,
fair enough.
So can I?
Go
I mean,
ahead, Tyler. Then I want to get
I
to.
just want to jump in real quick with the parallel and perpendicular, I guess, between CRT and DEI. So DEI started with good intentions, diversity, equity, inclusion, all on their own, all good things. Especially, like, I can give you an example of race equity, and even though I'm generally not a fan of it, if you look at trades and things with mentorship, mentorships are generally passed down a lot to family members and people you know. If there's a lot of mentorships in one racial community for, let's say, welding or, whatever, they're not going to reach into black communities as often because they're passed down to people that are commonly around you. And so having a little bit of a program to bring in groups that are less represented into those trades not only is better for those trades because they have a bigger pool of workers to select best merit from, but it's also just better for everybody. That fuck, I don't forgot what my second point was because
It's okay. Also, can you? I don't know if your mic's cutting out or if that's my internet or something, but
no,
yeah.
it's me. My mic shit.
Okay. But I wanted to. Joe's trying to signal, I think, to get in here. He's doing the blinky.
Yeah,
thing.
I'll unmute if I'm going to respond.
Okay.
I do have a response. If that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with a little bit of what David and Tyler are saying in a few nuanced ways. I will say that yes, there is something to be said and criticized about the superficial solving of problems, where we're not looking, and when I say we, I mean just like any type of community you find yourself in. If you believe an injustice is put upon you by an institution, you don't want a committee. Like a committee is not something that's going to be substantive. Now, because again, if I'm speaking in terms of reparations for American descendants of slaves, there's committees for days. The research has been done. The study has been studied. But then when it comes to substantive policy that is reinforced through those studies, that's when things fall short. So when we're looking at the equity portion of DEI, the justice portion, which is within that E of equity, what are we doing to recognize that a wrong has happened within the community, and what are we doing to course correct for that? Because if I'm speaking in terms of, we'll use the entrepreneurship and mentorship as an example, that we do recognize that, yeah, those things are passed down and certain communities are excluded because of the lineage of how that's passed down. How are we getting it so that other communities are engaging with this thing that we know is good for them? And that could be something like creating direct mentorship programs for those identifiable students who are being excluded. And the problem is when you do that, you can't do that at the expense of those other people who are receiving those things, because they will be upset. They will be very upset, where it's like, why are these people receiving this thing? Why can't they just do it the same way that I am? You got to be able to contextualize that to people in a way that makes sense outside of academia, outside of these studies, that this is why we're doing this. We're doing this because this group is excluded. This is how they're excluded. This is how you don't have to deal with that exclusion. And this is how we're approaching that and keeping a thumb on that.
Is
Because you
that,
don't want that to switch moving forward.
if I may though, Joe, is that actually happening? Are there groups that are being excluded because of DEI or anything? Or are there groups that are being taken away from because we have a policy of affirmative action or something like that, right?
Yes, we prioritized Asian and white students at the expense of everyone else, including white people. So what that looks like in practice is that when you engage with certain identifiable groups who are taking advantage of the tools that exist in America and playing the game in a way that these institutions tell you that you should play it, then you're going to have aspects of overperformance. And then when that overperformance happens, you have to recognize that, hey, different groups engage with this thing. As an example, it's ridiculous to get rid of the SAT. Certain identifiable groups, I'll speak directly for white and Asian students as an example, use that to show their metric of college competence. So if you remove the SAT for the sake of diversity and equity, you're missing the plot. You should recognize that there are different ways of displaying academic success, and different people are going to express these things differently. So we have to make sure that there are other options if you can't use the SAT as a metric to show your academic success, as one example. And that could be something like in hand, and I'm being very superficial, and in terms of time, it's a bit deeper than this, but like in terms of having direct interviews with the programs, with the people, with the higher ups within the programs, this could be more emphasis on college essays. This could be a higher emphasis on your raw extracurriculars as it relates to your major. And the music kind of gets this correct, where we recognize that musicians will have a level of competency, and sometimes their academics might not meet that competency. But even when we accept that student because we know they are going to be successful in this major, they still have to take gen ed courses. So if they're not competent in these gen eds that they have to take as requirements, what am I doing to make sure they have the tools to be successful when they finally get in? Stuff like that.
Okay. Thank you for the gift subs, Admiral Gibbs. Really appreciate you. Skill Tree Gaming for $5 says nothing is wrong with diversity. Diversity of thought can be good. It's bad when it's done at the sake of meritocracy in the name of equity. And then 𝕵𝖎𝖎 98 for 10 more euros. Let's be fair. None of this is diversity. It's just different shades of skin colors on upper to middle class graduates of Ivy Leagues with the same political beliefs. Let's talk about equity for a moment. My chat's going crazy whenever I say that word, by the way, right? They don't like equity, okay? They don't. Let me ask all of you.
It's not equality. Right?
Yeah, well, what's the difference in your opinion? Equity, equality, what do we mean by these terms? Go ahead.
Historically, equality, when people spoke about equality, they were speaking of equality of opportunity. And when they talk about equity, a lot of time they're talking about quality of outcome, right? That doesn't matter how hard you worked, whether you got the qualifications, got the skills, or had any talent, you're going to end up with the same result because the equity system is going to ensure that for you, right? So equality of outcome. And there's the we talk about the extreme voices, right? Like the 𝕾𝖎𝖎𝖙𝖘𝖍𝖔𝖜, and I'll use the 𝕾𝖍𝖎𝖙𝖘𝖍𝖔𝖜 paradigm, right? That I think disparity is a sign of unequal policy or something like that. So if you have an unequal outcome, that means things were stacked against people.
Well, couldn't it be
to paraphrase it? Which
sure, but if I may, right?
I disagree with that. That's
But why? So if you have a consistent pattern of outcome, a consistent pattern where in this locality, and this, let's use university as an example. You have this university in this community over and over again. It has primarily one type of group succeeds there, and the other types of groups underperform. Could that not be a sign that there is something wrong with the process, that they're treating those other groups that aren't succeeding in a way that is unjust or inequitable?
Could be
cultural.
racism in the gap.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I'm not
Or
saying
could be
that there
cultural,
definitely
right?
is. I'm not saying there definitely is. But, like, just like a red flag doesn't mean there's an actual mine there. It means there might be. I think that, again, if you have these consistent patterns of different outcomes, perhaps that is a sign that there is something going on that we need to address. Is that not eminently fair to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely, and it could be at least worth looking into and trying different things, even if they don't work. To answer equity is human intervention to help balance the scales after equality of opportunity has already taken place, or even beforehand. So equality of opportunity is what a liberal Western democracy.
Well, does
under
anyone disagree with
has.
my statement, by the way? I'm just curious.
I have some thoughts, but I'll let some others go.
Sure.
So yeah, equity isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just can be overused, and we can overcorrect for it. And I'm sure your chat has a slew of examples where that happened. But again, I keep going back to the Pell Grant. Like, if you want to put investment into your people, you take some taxpayer money and help people go to college, get a higher education. It benefits your economy, get some higher skilled jobs, more net income, higher GDP, blah blah blah. We can get rid of some shitty jobs overseas and overall improve our economy. That being said, the best way to do that, well, is to give some money to colleges. And so, like, do you want to give money to every single student that has to go to college? No, this person's parent has $10 million. So let's just give it to people who make less than $50,000 a year. That in its base form is equity. The Pell Grant is a form of equity that's not overdone. That's not really hurt breaking the bank. It's not hurting anybody, and it's allowing poor people who grew up in the inner city to go to college, get a nice 4-year degree, and then go into the workforce and, start a business, be me. So it works. It really,
And
I'll tell you, equity's
when you
good.
means test it, and Tyler, I think when you means test things like that, when you say we're going to help people who you know are poor, who don't have any money, or they don't have the $10 million parents, right? Um, I'd like to think that maybe that's the better approach, means testing, because if you means test it with a lot of these like very broad programs, then you are going to proportionally help everyone who is disadvantaged across all the different cultural and racial groups, right? If you do it by means testing, if you do it by identity group, that's where you're going to start creating disparities, overcorrecting, making those people resentful of those people and all this other stuff. But if you're like, look, we're going to means test and float all boats proportionally, right? If there are more poor people in this group over here, well, they're going to get more of them will be helped because it's all means testing. And I think that would be, but that's not what they're doing with DEI these days. That's not the focus, I don't think. And
That's
that's one
not
one
what
reason
people
I
are
have a
complaining
problem
about.
with it.
That's not what people are complaining about. Is all the good stuff that's happening you never hear about.
Okay, Joe's
Right.
been doing the bat signal here. And I do want to get Castle back
Sorry.
in here too, but let's go with Joe first, then we'll go to Castle.
Yeah, something that comes to mind for me is going back to the conversation about SATs, right? Like something that I mentioned, maybe I wasn't clear about that, but I'll say it again. Like the complete removal of the SAT will disproportionately hurt white and Asian Americans. Period. And the data supports this. But the question is, every identifiable group, and when I say identifiable group, I'm speaking specifically about identifiable groups recognized by the U.S. Census. So that's white, black, Hispanic, non-white, Hispanic, white, etc. Those groups might be engaging with the SAT differently. So a way that I would see as a matter of equity would be saying, hey, different people are going to have different ways of showing academic success. We can make the SAT one of those metrics, but let's have others so that we can assess student ability in different ways without using the SAT as the flat metric for everyone, because that's clearly not working. And that to me is an equitable approach. An unequitable approach would be taking that truth that Asian Americans and white Americans disproportionately perform at proficiency or greater on SATs. And because of this, because it hurts other groups, we will just do away with it entirely. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the thing that I'm not down with. I'm not down with this idea that, these like the only way to get rid of this tool and to help others is to do away with it entirely. No, other groups built their entire identity within a field towards that. And you should respect that and just say that, hey, let's look at other metrics for success and then means test that and then see how the data transpires and then keep checking these things,
Sure.
Like
Create other paths, other ways of getting there, right? Rather than punishing some group.
Castle, go ahead.
yeah, yeah, Joe, I think like talking about weighting it differently is like, beforehand, if you got a 1600 on your SAT, you're admitted to Harvard. Now it's like, maybe you get a 1350 on your SAT, but you did a community service or you have other things on your resume that stand out that can also help you get in. So I agree with that. I
Not
don't
to
think we
cut
should.
you off, Castle, because I want to hear the rest of your plane. Texas, I think, has an admissions program where if you hit a certain GPA percent or GPA, you're automatically into certain state schools. I think there's some people probably in Texas in chat that can probably confirm where that is, but I know there's a program that exists in Texas.
Interesting. I didn't know that. But that makes sense to me. I was just going to say too, when Tyler was talking about equality and equity, like having equity be that kind of safeguard when equality doesn't come through. And one of the examples that I always think about is when I think it was a study of when people would send in their resume and they were identical, but one had a black sounding name or minority sounding name, and one had a white person's name, and the white person was picked every time. I think that's where equity helps, because I don't know how else you solve for that. If people are discriminating against you just based on how your name sounds, if the qualifications are there. So that was just something that I just thought was interesting.
David
Wick,
wants
did
to
you?
interject, but he's too polite, so I'm going to do it for him. David, go
Sorry, yeah,
ahead.
David, go for it.
That I can't remember the exact name of the study, but it was the Jamal and something study, and I have a problem with that study. So they picked uh, names that sounded, very sort of urban black type names, right? And then they stacked them against Brad and Sue and Jennifer, right? And I'm like, if you wanted to be accurate with that, stack them against Billy Bob and Jolene Lynn, and put some weird Slavic sounding ones like 𝕾𝖍𝖎𝖙 or something, because
Bubba.
these are not like if your name is Will Smith, or Jim, Stevens, right? And you happen to be a black person with that name, your resume is going to be accepted, right? But if you have a name that sounds ethnic, right? For lack of a better way, because historically speaking, right? If if I don't know how old everyone is in the group, but I remember, the days of the Cold War, where if you had a Russian sounding or East European Slavic sounding name, you got the stink eye from a lot of people. You put it, and you didn't really want to tell people that that was your last name, because it ended in Insky or 𝕵𝖎𝖎𝖙𝖘 or something. Now we don't really care, because 99, Cold War ended, blah blah blah. But
Well, I mean,
um,
I don't know if
so
you
that
have a
study,
very Russian sounding name in certain circles, you're probably not going to have a
well,
good
right
day.
now, yeah, I mean, so the study took like apples and oranges. They took Jamal and Shaniqua, and compared them to Brad and Susan, when I
That's
think it would have been more accurate to compare them to Billy Bob and Betty Sue and 𝕾𝖍𝖎𝖙𝖘𝖍𝖔𝖜 or
I
whatever.
Yeah, I think
That's
that's kind of the point, though, right? Like, you are taking a white person's name and putting it up against maybe an urban name.
what is a white person's name, though? What is a white person's name? Because there's lots of black people with
Yeah,
like
well,
Yeah.
white
there's
sounding names.
exceptions for sure,
Yeah,
like you mentioned, like a Will Smith or John Brown or something like that. Like, but I think the point was to show how easily the biases that we have, when at least for college applications or for job applications, that people have. I don't think it was to say that all black people won't get accepted. I just think it was like an
I don't
obvious
think
point.
I don't think they want a Billy Bob either. That's the point I'm making. Is I think they
I
would be
agree.
discriminating against Billy Bob and Betty Lynn. Hmm? Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I like when you mentioned that part. That I think that would have been a good part
Let
to add
me.
to the study, if you had a country sounding name compared to a Jason Williams or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just thought that was part of the equity argument that I think that made sense to me, and also when
So
we're talking about. Sorry, go for it.
no, I just want to interrogate that. This is to you, Castle, right? And I guess less so, I should say, to Tyler. But to kind of interrogate what you guys are saying here is you keep saying things like equity is good when equality misses the mark. It's good to have equity on your side to kind of to prevent overcorrections and try to kind of make sure that those groups who aren't being serviced get serviced, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems to me, and we can look at several examples of this, right? Like both in university settings, also in the workplace settings. NPR, I think, is going through it right now. These things, when they get implemented in practice, while in principle very sound. In practice, at least in the systems in America, and I can't speak so much to the European stuff, right? Or the Canadian stuff. Ooh, Canadian, right? But for the Americans, the again, when we see these things put into practice, generally what happens is it is exclusive rather than inclusive. It, as Joe mentioned, takes away rather than adds to. And that's for a variety of reasons. But given that, first of all, you can contest that if you'd like. But if this is true, if what I'm saying is true, perhaps the principle has a flaw that we can't see. What do you think?
And I didn't want to just because it kind of goes against my argument here, but I think I was going to get to that Wick a little, where, and this goes back to our conversation maybe 10 minutes ago. So if we forgot what we were talking about, I don't blame you. But we had legacy rich white people and legacy admissions getting into colleges, right? We had people who can afford SAT prep, send their kids to these classes. People in minority urban Black communities don't have that. And so what happened was now you have funding from the other side pushing that more toward the center, and now it's starting to overcorrect a little bit. And so I think that's where you're talking about a little bit, Wick, is like the implementation of that is starting to push it, where now we're seeing kind of like the reverse of that, where if you're a white rich person who got into Harvard because your dad went there,
I don't care. Okay,
now
I'm
it's
going to
starting to
interrupt
say,
you. I
oh,
don't
you're
give a
what?
shit. I don't give a shit about the rich people, right? I don't care. Like maybe there's something there. I don't know. That's not who I'm worried about. I live in very rural Pennsylvania, right? I know people in Appalachia. I have friends there in Kentucky and things like that, right? They're the ones that are struggling with these things.
No,
They're
I'm
the
just
ones
talking
that are
about why
are
I'm
getting
just talking about
hurt.
the pushback to that history of how people were getting into schools before. Now you're saying that, oh, if we have DEI, we can have people come in through this matter, which now is viewed as like the reverse, right? It's like, oh, you just got in here because you're a different skin color. And I think that's a problem, right? I don't think that that should just be considered something that you were born with as something that makes you better than somebody else. So I don't think this is an argument about like you're being rich and white, because there are people in, you know, Appalachia who are just as deserving. They don't have the best schools to go to. They don't have the resources that many other people in these struggling poorer communities have as well. They're getting overlooked. So that's why I think I agree on that front, where you have certain people where these funds should be allocated to, that they get mad and then they view that as a racial thing. And then that's where the discussion
Well,
becomes, it's
that's
about you
how
versus me.
DEI is almost always implemented that I've seen on racial lines.
There's a part to this I think is getting kind of lost here.
Oh, please.
Because I think there's a contradiction in what David said, but I don't think he's exactly incorrect. And there's something at Castles that I kind of want to contextualize. I think the folks that were legacy applications and legacy admissions understand what this should be about. It should be about, hey, based on your relationship with this institution, I believe, because data will support this, that it will come to this conclusion. One of the things that legacy admissions bring is patronage to the university itself. And that patronage is of value, and that's a bargaining tool. Because if you don't accept a legacy applicant, you are basically saying that this family is no longer worthy to be engaging with this institution. Now, with that being said, that's a lineage thing. So we can look at that and go, hey, based upon I'll use ADOS as an example here. Based on the lineage of American descendants of slaves, they are excluded from these institutions in X, Y, and Z way, and being very clear and precise about how I'm talking about the specificity of what that means. Because if you say we are going to create grants for Black students, that's not specific enough. But if you say we are creating grants and scholarships for American descendants of slaves, that is specific, because within the Black racial demographic, you have African immigrants, immigrants from the Caribbean, American descendants of slaves, American born but first generation Black Americans. All those people exist within Black, but in this particular injustice that exists within this institution, we are targeting this particular group that relates to that. And then going to David's point, which I agree with, is that names point somewhere. And depending on your field, there's going to be bias that exists there. If you know that a certain demographic ethnically has a proclivity to go to that particular field, the name itself can infer if the applicant is worthy or not, and that's not something we should have. So I agree with the idea that Billy Bob points to poor white. I agree with the idea that Billy Jane points to poor white, and that is bias. That is bias based upon name that shouldn't exist in applications. I do agree that there are different representations of those indexicals. Indexical is just a fancy word of saying a word pointing to something that exists with white demographic, with white people. And we got to engage with that, and especially if you're looking to make sure that you're creating an equitable environment.
Can I answer your question real quick? You were asking, what the fuck was I just wrote down?
You know what?
How does the
Give it a minute, right? Like, you'll get there. I
how
promise.
does DEI keep coming to these essentially exclusive outcomes for white? Why does DEI?
Exclusionary, you mean?
Yeah, how does it become exclusionary,
Exclusionary,
especially for like whites, Asians, etc. And that's again partially because again, as I keep saying, it's a zero-sum game in some aspect. There's only so many jobs. There's only so many seats at Harvard. There's only and Castle, those legacy people, they're still getting it. They're all those changes to Harvard and everything. They're still taking all those legacy people in. It's the other 60% that are getting jostled around. So at the end of the day, it kind of boils down to an old left-wing argument between two different factions of, is society oppressed based on race or is it based on class? And I kind of see I'm siding with the class argument hands down almost 100% of the time over the race argument, and it kind of carries over here as well. But like, I see this broken down on a class aspect, and everyone here is kind of agreeing that if we break this down on a class aspect, or what he's saying, even just
Okay, give me an
switch-
example of. You mentioned the Pell Grant as DEI. I don't think
Yeah.
when we talk about DEI, no one's referring to the Pell Grant. When we talk about
That's just
DEI, we're talking about the programs instituted in universities, institutions, and workplaces, which during their hiring practice and things like that. Pell Grant is a grant, right? It's giving, for lack of a better word, I know this is not the correct term, don't come after me, charity to groups who cannot afford a thing so that they can have a thing, right? Like, this isn't an access, strictly like an access thing.
Well,
So
I've
when
already
we talk, let me finish. When we talk about things like DEI, we're talking about things where let's use Harvard as an example. You're right. They have a limited number of seats. How are they picking those seats? Is it on merit or is it on other factors? And if it's on other factors, what are those factors? Why are those factors, etc.? And those factors aren't class-based. Those other factors are not class-based whatsoever. Those other factors are racial-based, which is different. So when you say that these are mostly class-based, I just disagree.
Again, we don't hear about the 95% of the time that this is done
So
correctly.
give me an example.
Every Fortune 500 company has implemented this. We don't see their stocks plummet. It just sometimes shows up in
What does
Disney.
that?
Yeah, that's an
Well,
example
I mean,
of
it's
all
just
these
an
companies.
additional expense.
Yeah, but okay. Still, might the price go up 2 cents on each good sold. These companies are implementing these hiring practices, and we're not seeing a decline. Like, what do you measure as success? Like, success to me is
So, for example,
making a change
do they
and
do
then
anything?
not accepting or hurting your bottom line.
go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little too involved. Go ahead, David. Take it.
I was just gonna say, well, I mean, we don't see their stock go up or down all that much because I don't think these policies and programs and all these DEI and diversity offers actually do anything. I don't. If anything, there was a study a while back that I think one of you guys mentioned even was harmful to people's racial attitude, and in fact made them more prejudiced. So I don't think that in terms of what value do these DEI programs bring to a company or an institution, I think they bring no value. I think they're a waste of money. I think they could be taking those funds and making a much better use of them rather than just employing a bunch of sort of political officers at the university and the corporate level in as sort of an expanded HR bureaucracy.
I'll give you
One thing I
if I
wanted
may.
to mention, though, and I know I can. So go ahead. Go ahead.
No, finish your point. But I have a specific example. I wish more of you had brought in specific examples on all sides. But yeah, I have a specific example to address this. But go ahead.
Okay. One thing that when we talk about, I think Tyler, you brought up that you see it as a zero-sum model, a zero-sum game, where if you give a position to somebody for whatever reason, let's say because you have a new racial quota you want to satisfy, or whatever, you're taking away from someone else. Yes, I think that's true to some degree, but I think there's what's missing a lot of the time, and this maybe speaks to what Joe was talking about, is that there, like, population and the economy, let's say, of the United States, grows. I mean, it's a bigger economy, it's a bigger country, it's more people. Um, Harvard is, I don't know what the numbers are for Harvard. I was trying to secretly quickly look them up here, but like, are they, how many, what's the enrollment in Harvard today versus 20, 30 years ago, right? I'm assuming there are more students than there were before. There are more jobs in America than there were before. There are more people than there were before. So it's not exactly zero sum. There's growth, um, and I think that creates some room for maybe some of these new paths that Joe was talking about, like other ways of doing it. But I think the DEI approach is takes a punitive view, and I think it says, well, no, we have to take those people down a notch or two
I
in
think I
order
get
to.
what
And I'm
Wick's
like,
getting
well,
at
can't you
with what
just
you're
lift
saying.
these people up?
I think I get what
Yeah.
Wick's getting at with what you're saying here, and I can give you when you look at a company, what does a DEI do for a company? In terms of the production value and quality, if it doesn't go down, then that's a win in those specific areas. But really, the number one bottom line expense for most companies is advertising. If these companies are investing into DEI to virtue signal to a group of consumers, hey, we're on your level, come spend your money here. This is cheap advertising for them to be as cynical and at the end of the day as possible. And that to them is growing their market value and market share. So that's how it's benefiting them. They're
PR.
like at
Yeah.
the end of the and like however, the same thing, like what do you measure success? Their grades aren't changing. They're still the most prestigious college in the world. Like they aren't
I don't
diminished
know.
like a community college.
Look, Tyler, I don't know if we should to measure the success of these programs on how much money it makes the company when the goal is to increase inclusivity, increase diversity. Why would their stock going up or down have anything to do with that goal? I don't think it
I agree.
does. And I think that's a bad metric to look at when we look at, are these programs succeeding? What I would like out of these programs, because I believe in diversity, not just diversity on an aesthetic level, but on a diversity of thought level. That's part of the show, having a diverse crowd of opinions to talk about issues. But when we talk about like measures for success, we have to look at how is the company, institution, university, whatever, how is it dealing with those individuals, right, in those groups that may be struggling. We can look at examples, and I'll give you an specific example. I was looking for the company. It escapes me at the moment, and so I won't guess until I get the exact source. But recently, one of these things that happen when we use these kind of race-based characteristics to make decisions, and companies use this to make decisions and things like that, is an Asian person will complain about certain hiring practices or policies in the company, and they will go and criticize those people who are in charge of that. Those people happen to be black, and so that they say, well, no, you're just being anti-black. So you can't really criticize us. This happens over and over and over again, and this is a result of this kind of looking at it strictly from a racial lens and not implementing other things like that. I'll find you the specific example, right? But this happened very recently. But do you know what I'm talking about, David?
Yeah, I read that one too.
Are you
Yeah, I
familiar?
know. I read that one too. I'm trying to remember
Yeah,
which
it's
one it was.
like
I read it yesterday.
it was
Yeah.
at the tip of my tongue. Like, but you guys
Yeah.
I'm not here to defend like some bad implementations and
But-
bad arguments. I'm here to
but the point is, the argument is that this happens to be the rule rather than the exception.
Right. To speak to what you were saying, Wick, about what is the purpose? What is the purpose of the DEI, right? Programs and the trainings and the people who are pushing the stuff. What is their goal? And I think the purported goal is to reduce racism, like when they implement a
Oh,
training
it was
program
at the
in a company or-
ACLU. Just to be clear, ACLU.
Yes,
Thank you,
that's
thank you,
right.
thank you. Go ahead.
That's right. And to reduce disparities. And one of the problems, and like you said, like, well, are they succeeding? Tyler, I mean, yes, these companies are still making money. They're still doing business. They have these programs. It's not really harming them. It's good PR for them. It makes them look good to different demographics. Fine. what is the actual core purpose of these things, right? And how do we measure that, whether they're effective? Like, for instance, there was you were asking for specific examples, Wick. I guess last year there was the story of the professor down in Florida. Uh, the I think his name Eric Stewart or someone. He was fired because he was faking his data on sort of racial attitudes. He was well known. The guy's been cited over 8,500 times, and a bunch of you. I'm sure some of you guys may have read about this guy. And
Hmm.
he was the Dubois Fellow at the National Institute of Justice, influential academic, and he was saying, "Oh, attitudes towards blacks and involving like lynching and crime and punishment, all these sort of sociological criminology type field studies that he was doing, and his work was being sort of used to create social and political narratives between to narratives about racial tensions and racial groups, which didn't even exist because he was faking his research, right? So how do we measure these DEI programs when the academics are lying? Are they're activists? They're not doing academic work. They're doing activist work and using their academic credentials as a veneer to pursue their sort of more
Yeah,
radicalized, more
capital.
aggressive political agendas,
Use
right?
capitalism, dog. With the same measure, like you just measure how many people are moving up into the middle and upper middle class over time and these demographics that previously weren't. Now, like there's a little bit of separation because it's hard to kind of compare the white demographic and the black demographic one to one like that because the black demographic is significantly younger. So they're going to have more criminals, they're going to have less income coming in than the white demographic that's in their 50s, I think median age or something like that. I have to look at the numbers to be exact. You can't compare them one to one, but investment into these communities and these things do act in a way as a form of investment. Sometimes you find affirmative action doesn't work in a lot of cases because people are getting put into schools that they aren't ready to get into and they flunk out at higher rates or drop out at higher rates. Absolutely. So that policy didn't work, but the intent there is good. Go on to the next policy, try something different, accept that it didn't work, but keep working to get these groups into these areas that they previously weren't. That's like it's not that
I think
bad.
no, and like a lot of programs are good. I think it's when they are pursuing and they're pushing different sort of narratives that create more animosity than solve it. And to your point about these different jobs and people, one thing that a lot of people forget is the last 30 years of what they call upward mobility jobs, right? Like the jobs that your former uh, poor or lower sort of level, very basic blue collar, unskilled labor type people in communities who don't have college training, university degrees, or even trade apprenticeships that they would have gotten over the last 30 years. 30 years of offshoring millions of jobs to Asia, right? Like that's happened at the same time as a lot of these programs have been like, hey, we want to help lift these people up, but where are all the jobs? Right? They've sent them overseas, right? So those jobs that historically people would have said, well, hey, I worked at the plant or the factory, and now my kids can go to college, right? That's a story of upward mobility that a lot of sort of immigrants and a lot of historic poor have been able to tell, right? My kid's the first in our family to go to college, blah blah blah. I think for the last 30 years, I think there's been a bit of a that's been depressed somewhat, and I think a lot of people saying, "Hey, where are my opportunities?" I think, and maybe all the tensions we're having with China are going to be a good thing because maybe some of it'll come back, right?
I don't know
I
about that.
David, you
I want to get
But
some
mentioned.
more people in, but finish your point, then I want to toss the mic to someone else.
no, that's
David,
it.
I was just going to
So
mention that when you brought up how some of these studies are backed by activists in the space, I'm going to be really vague here, but there was some study that came out by somebody about racism or something, and the point of it was that there was like it was not happening in certain areas, like black people weren't being discriminated against, and when that data came out, people were like, "Well, you're wrong." And that was their excuse. It's like, well, it can't because I know racism
You
exists, so
gotta
your
be
data is
you gotta be at
faulty.
least a little more specific than that.
I
There's
know,
some study
I
on
know.
racism that was done by
It's
so is
some.
something
the
I
role
saved down,
prior
but I
story.
just think the point is that sometimes even when data comes out, to David's point, is like you have people who don't want to accept the data or certain truths, or you have people behind the data that can shape a narrative. But either way, I know that we were talking a little bit about this earlier, but I think when we, yeah, I'm trying to remember now myself, but when we're talking about, at least in the workplace too, I was just thinking of how I think when we see the hiring practices that have happened, and I think people have even had like lawsuits in this space as well. Some of it can be using DEI to fuel that. For example, at one of the bigger bank companies, I think somebody was saying he was fired because of DEI because he was white, and he wasn't because he was a bad employee, but because he was discriminated against because he was white. So it's kind of interesting to see DEI be used that way for people on the other side of it. So I think there's some kind of like interesting ways it's being used to kind of create that division as well. I had another point, but I forgot, so I'll let
That's fine.
someone else take it.
Joe, did you want to get in?
Yeah, I kind of have a thought experiment to sort of like see where y'all are at on. Let's say Harvard University, and you could prove this through, we'll say we're going to presuppose that this was proven through data and other ways of collection of information that can be historical accounts, etc. If we could prove that Harvard explicitly, whether that be explicitly doing it as a matter of the law or a matter of public policy locally, let's say we could, excuse me, we could reasonably prove that they excluded American descendants of slaves from their institution. I'm just wondering what y'all would think would be a good approach to rectifying that. Like, let's say you had a collection of American descendants of slaves, and they could prove that their families were explicitly excluded from Harvard University. What do you think should be a remedy in the present?
Civil rights law? Isn't that so? What civil rights laws are for? They could prove
Yeah,
it.
kind of like the same case
Like,
against the Asian students at Harvard. I would assume they would take on the same court case.
yeah, isn't that
Sure. No, I'm saying if you're Harvard University, what do you think you should do as a member of
Oh,
that institution that excluded that group?
oh, apologize probably, and PR fucking disaster relief probably. Whoever on that family wants to come to your college, you get them a house next door, whatever. Like, pay their whole way through. I mean, they probably wouldn't want to look awful. It depends on what group it is too. Like, some groups are
Sure.
kind of, if you exclude against them, it's not such a big deal as it compared to others.
What's a group that's okay to exclude?
None, but less
Canadians.
less bad. Yeah, Canadians.
True.
Fair.
Yeah,
The
Italian.
reason why I asked that is because I think that is an example of how institutions should be engaging with the problem, right? So, like, there are a lot, and again, like, it's a little bit of a bait question. I'm sorry in advance. A lot of institutions explicitly excluded American descendants of slaves as a matter of policy. And that could be policy directly within the university itself, or just a reflection of the practices, policies, procedures, and laws that existed at that current time. I think it's reasonable to say if you are an American descendant of slaves that's still within that community, so you're still within the Harvard community, like when I say Harvard, we'll say like the Massachusetts, Boston, Broad community, like that area. And like, let's say you lived in that area, you could prove that you lived in that area for multiple generations, going all the way back to when Harvard was in existence and in existence in your area. I think it's reasonable to say if that individual applies to Harvard University, they should get a special treatment considering that
Should
lineage.
they?
That's what I mean when in terms of like lineage-based policy.
You're
Could
a
there be
private
a
institution.
scholarship for someone like that?
Sorry, one more time.
Would would there not be a scholarship, for instance, for would that as opposed to I think one of the issues people have with DEI is that it's the there's the joke now didn't earn it, right? And there's the whole Claudine Gay story where where she a lot of people got positions given to them maybe that they weren't qualified for, and I think that's
Yeah.
a criticism that people have. I think in the terms of the ADOS community, if there is such a test, and that sounds like a pretty rigorous standard that you've described to prove that someone is of that sort of historic exclusion. would it not make sense to say, look, we will have a generous scholarship for such people as long as they can satisfy the academic requirements that everyone else does? And I think that would allay any of this sort of like, we're not just letting people in because of their skin color, because of their history, right? You still have to hold up the Harvard standard, but now we're going to give you the full ride.
I 1,000% agree with that. Where I think that and again, the reason why I use like Harvard and then like the geolocation as an example, I don't think it's reasonable for somebody who is not a member of that community to take claim to those type of benefits. So let's say, like in my example, right? So I'm an American descendant of slaves, and my ancestors came from Sarasota, Florida. I think it's unreasonable for me to appeal to Rutgers University for my injustice claim, if that makes sense. And I also think it's unfair for me to appeal to, let's say, like a local. I'm not good with Florida, so I'm not really good at universities. I think it's also unfair for me to appeal to Sarasota, Florida for admission to a university that's over there, because I'm not a member of that community. I might have a lineage of injustice as it relates to the institution, but I don't have a lineage line that points directly back to that institution definitively across my lifetime. And there can be a bunch of reasons for why that happens.
So
I think. Sorry, go for it.
No, my concern with this, Joe, if I may, push back a little. So the results, because we've had things that again aren't as rigorous, but have happened that are comparable. California used to have a racial admissions law, right, where you could you got bonus points and things like that. When they struck that down, when they made it law that you could not use race as a factor in admissions, performance of black students actually shot up, whereas they had a large failure rate in comparison. That went down, and they started getting honors classes. They started getting all these things, and that is because that instead of getting into places, right, where they were not prepared for, they were placed properly, right, placed into institutions and academic universities which met their skill level. So I worry when you have an injustice claim, even if you've lived in a community that has historically discriminated against your group, and all that's true. All that's true. It doesn't change the fact that sometimes, because of these historic injustices, you are in a place where you will not perform well there because you're just not prepared for it. And it's not your fault. A lot of historical reasons for that. But what it will do is it'll set them up for failure. And that's my fear. Please.
Yeah, and I would say that fear is an outlier to what the reality actually is, where I don't think that people would be, as an example, when it comes to American descendants of slaves from Boston, I think it's reasonable to believe that those who are looking to go to Boston, who are American descendants of slaves, are already applying there in the first place. But it's recognizing that, hey, because of your relationship, your lineage with my institution, it's reasonable for me to pay a special attention when you do apply. Because there is a place where we can point to and say, you would not have been admitted regardless of your rigor or not. And with that being said, when it comes to justice, I think it's also reasonable, right? And I'm going to do this argument. I'm going to piss a lot of people in your chat off. I think it's reasonable to say, as a matter of justice, that universities should admit all of the displaced Palestinians that have got their universities and places of institutions bombed by our weapons.
So
I think it's fair to say if a university came forward.
I'm not going to respond.
Tyler, stop. Tyler, stop.
No, I'm saying
Let him finish.
I'm saying it's a matter of justice. Like I'm saying it's a matter of justice, right? Like if you are looking at the situation as an institution and you say, hey, my government is funding like supporting the funding of the very thing. And I'm not saying government here, I'm saying the student government, because certain universities have a direct lineage line with the military and then with the United States government directly to the very bombs and other types of military equipment that's being used in Gaza right now. I think it's reasonable for that university to say, we bear a certain level of responsibility to your people, so we will admit you to our university
Okay.
because of that.
I just have to
I
ask.
think
No,
that's
stop.
a fair thing to do.
Stop,
gotcha.
stop, Tyler, stop. I'm going to ask, but I'm very curious because this is not a concept that I have heard articulated before, and I'm very curious what all of you think about it. So just a quick show of hands. Do you think that universities who have these ties, as Joe mentioned, should make it a point to privilege Palestinian refugees and others who've had their university experience disrupted because of the war in Gaza right now? Raise your hand if you agree with that.
You already
No
know where I'm
one
at.
Doesn't
here
that go against
agrees
this
with
point?
that. Why not? Go
Let
ahead.
me in
Well,
there. Let me
I
in
was
there
gonna
because
say-
I'm listening to this.
Are we here to talk about? Are we here to talk about Gaza and?
Nope.
no, I'm
but
not gonna
this
talk about
does
that.
this does
I-
mention
To be as
when
clear
we
as
talk
I
about
can, like real quick, to be as clear as I can, like I'm using this as an example, but the claim I'm making here is that if you as an institution can prove you are contributing to the harm of someone else, I think it is fair to pay special attention to that individual because you are indirectly or otherwise responsible to their disruption.
But this
whether that be
just
don't
to
think
be
that's real, so
clear, right? Just
I
to be
just don't
clear,
even think that's a real thing.
this does relate to DEI. This is kind of at the heart of this discussion, right?
I was
That
gonna say just like real quick, that this argument is kind of a little bit removed, but I'll just for sake of argument, I
why
think
is
when we
it
talk about
removed? I think it's
Harvard,
directly related.
well, when we talk about Harvard, they're not dropping bombs on Palestinians. I agree with Joe. Like in terms of descendants of slaves, I think that's a total correct, historical failure. And then when we're talking about Harvard and Israel and that whole thing, I can understand the funding piece. But we were also just talking, Joe, I think we were agreeing on the fact that just because you have a GPA that's a 4.0, we're not going to let you into college if your GPA is a 2.0, but you're discriminated against. I still think DEI should be in place for people who are at the same wavelength as other people who are just overlooked in the process. And I think that when we talk about I guess in this case Palestinians whose homes have been bombed, which I don't want to get into the whole situation, but I think that's so a little bit way too far removed from the DEI case here, but just my
Why?
opinion.
You have a group, and we don't have to use Palestinians. We use any refugee group. Ukrainian refugees coming over.
They're not American though.
So my family were refugees from communism. They escaped Yugoslavia and arrived in North America with nothing, and got nothing. Were given nothing. None of the free stuff that's being given to people now. And they starved. They lived poor, and the first generation, and they made something themselves just so that the first generation born here, which would be me, gets to be called privileged and vilified as a horrible, evil oppressor. So mm, you how do you decide who's oppressed and who deserves what and who gets a hand up? I mean, do you let's put everyone in a Harvard. Because hey, why not?
Wouldn't it
right?
have been nice though
it's
if your ancestors would have had a program or something or resources that they could have drawn upon?
My parents, you mean?
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, they were given. They were said. Yeah. There was a job to go out and cut down trees in the forest so they could make a bit of money and feed the kids, right? And that was as good as it got. The rest was up to them to kind of claw their way forward. And that's a very common immigrant experience for a lot of people.
Bootstrap.
And,
Gotcha.
and well,
Listen,
I mean, yeah.
Let me jump in here real quick
Sorry, go
because
ahead, Tyler.
I think Joe's policy here for his essentially racial ancestral lineage being a factor in your admission into college is a form of grievance politics. I think the focus needs to be moving forward to recognize the problem we have today and move forward to correct it, not looking back to the past and trying to solve injustices.
But let's look at a current injustice. Again, a refugee, a current crisis that is currently ongoing.
Well, I'm going to get to that. It's a whole summary because it kind of goes against his SAT point. Because if you start letting people in, and look at Palestine, everyone in Palestine that wants to go to Harvard gets put in before the meritocracy. You completely destroy the merit of Harvard. You've just put a bunch of people in that would never pass Harvard standards under normal circumstances, and you took Harvard and made it basically a place for people that have a problem with the United States foreign policy. Things like to that degree, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, Jewish people were barred from Harvard. There's letters where they sent the dean of Columbia questions asking when he was going to deal with the Jewish plague that was in his college 60 years ago. All these people will be accepted into Harvard. If you could find any form of oppression from the U.S. government, you're accepted that Harvard agrees with in some vague way, you're accepted into Harvard. It would completely destroy Harvard being the special institution it is. And that was kind of like the SAT thing. It would be the crawl to the bottom for everybody that communists usually implement in their policies.
And the thing that I would push back on that and to say, what makes Harvard so special that they're allowed to do these things to people and get away with it? Like that, I think, is the question to engage with, right? Because if we say that, like, okay, I'll use a Jewish example, right? I hate using the Jewish example for a lot of reasons here, because Jewish Americans were excluded from institutions. Like, that's just factual, and people can just deal with that. But I think that when it comes to the level of redress, what do you do? And that's the thing that I'm kind of knock at here, is that I'm not saying that you let Palestinians in to Harvard one-to-one as it engages with Harvard University. I do think it's fair to say, and again, I'm using Harvard as an example here. I don't have any connection. I don't have any proof that Harvard has a direct connection with the United States government as it relates to the military-industrial complex. So don't come after my DMs with that bullshit. I'm using Harvard as an example here as a placeholder to move the conversation, right? So like, if you could prove that, right? If you can prove that as a matter of fact, where it's like Harvard directly is responsible through funding and otherwise that this place in another country is destroyed, I think it's reasonable then for them to create refuge and an infrastructure so that those people can continue their education at your university. And whatever that looks like to them is going to be up to them to decide. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. I'm not saying that like those in Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza, should just be accepted to Harvard without any level of rigor as it relates to Harvard. I'm saying that Harvard should be a place of refuge for them because of that responsibility aspect and the justice aspect of saying that, hey, my university, or we as a university, were directly responsible for your harm, and this is how we want to redress that. That's the point I'm trying to make here.
What actions would Harvard have to been taken then to be responsible for, like, just endorsing the war? Like, maybe they have right now isn't enough. What would they, in this hypothetical scenario, have done? Because that's kind of an important component.
We better just give all the Palestinian refugees jobs at Lockheed Martin, wouldn't it? Right? Give them
shipping barges.
Do you think maybe there's reasons we shouldn't? Okay, never mind. I won't get it. No, we're not going to talk about that today.
Yeah. No, like, so a way that could look like, right, to kind of answer that question a little bit more directly, is that, like, if you had, I'm going to make it super American, because I know their chat's predominantly Americans and some second-class citizens that they call themselves Canadians. That's okay. Canadians are welcome outside this planet. Anyway, so I think that if I had a Ford facility in Canada, right, and that Ford facility, we'll say that, like, apathetic engagement with that facility led to it being closed, I think it's fair for Ford, even though it's in Canada, replace those workers within the Ford infrastructure in the United States. I think that it's fair to say, if your university, like, let's say you're, I'm going to be a little direct here, and it's going to piss some libs off, but if you could say that your university definitively endorsed Joe Biden and what Joe Biden is doing in Gaza, and like you can see a direct correlation through money, through support of organizations like AIPAC, through support of other different pro-Zionist organizations, and you can prove that definitively, that there's a connection all the way to the president, I think that's a situation where I think it's fair if there was a collection of people at the university saying, we don't agree with this, so we want to offer our institution and our engagement with these institution as refuge so that you can continue your education. That's the point I'm trying to make here. And again, it has nothing to do with, and again, I'm using like Joe Biden here, because it ruffles lip feathers, and ruffling lip feathers is funny. But I think it's still fair to say, hey, if your institution is doing direct contributions to something that's causing harm to other people, and you can definitively show that, I think it's fair for, at the level of justice in a DEI framework, to provide assistance to those people. And I extend that even to, like, in the case of, like, for Palestinians, I from students to doctors to educators, like, I think that's a fair thing if you look into that framework.
Okay.
In that way.
Before I let you guys answer and respond, $50 from Lex Friedman to say thank you for hosting this difficult conversation. Well, thank you, Lex Friedman, for the $50. I appreciate it. But responses to that, do you think that do we agree with him?
I was just gonna say, I think I was with Joe for a little bit there, and then kind of lost me a little bit. But like, I think when we're talking about this issue, you know, I think Tyler asked too. It's like, well, what does Harvard have to? I think we're getting like too far removed from what exactly it is, and like with the direct lineage of slaves, like that's an easy. We know what happened there. I think with Harvard, if they were funding which missile strike was happening, I think that's pretty clear. But then when it gets to, well, they support this person who then maybe sent money to this person who supports this person, then it's like, I don't know how exactly you would be able to like link that in a way where it would have like a positive effect, because then you could, it's almost a question. It's like, okay, why didn't we have people from Japan when we nuked Hiroshima come to, you know, the United States for school and things like that? So it's like, I don't know how far you have to go back to and then apply the same logic that we had never done before, but then kind of use that for the future, at least in the Palestinian case. So I think it just gets a little too hazy where we draw the line there.
Yeah, to argue specifically against that point, it kind of goes to the unrealistic standard of war that Israel is held to in comparison to all other nations.
Again,
like,
I just to interject, I want to make sure that we don't go into the Israel versus Gaza specifically. That's not the topic here. But I promise you, we'll talk about that another day. That topic will come up. But today we're talking specifically about DEI and how it relates to these injustice claims and things like that.
In a perfect world, it would be fantastic if when we went to war with another nation, or Israel with another nation, if we had a plan set up for all of our troops that come home and all the mental and physical illnesses that they were going to fake, and make sure that they were taken care of for the rest of their life, maybe never had to work again. That'd be awesome. It'd be awesome if we could have a plan to set this place up with infrastructure that wasn't called nation building, which is what we tried to do in Iraq. So, I mean, they'd be great if there was some magical way to help the people of the nation that's being attacked. But like at some point, you have to put a little bit of onus on the nation that elected a terrorist. Never mind. Let's next.
Again, we're not
Hey,
here to talk about that. But go ahead.
Here's an idea for that: is that if, I mean, ultimately, once at some point, hopefully soon, sooner rather than later, the conflict is resolved. You know, the Palestinian people are going to have to rebuild, and maybe the people who feel strongly that they want to help the academics, the people at universities, and whatever, people with skills and knowledge that they want to impart, maybe programs could be set up to have them go to Gaza and help rebuild the universities there and the schools there, so that, you know, as opposed to a hypothetical of like Harvard letting a bunch of people in from somewhere else. Like I think one of the things that people forget is that, like, when we feel, well, should we bring all the people, like, we want to accept refugees, right? We want to be humanitarian. That's a good thing. It's a positive thing. Immigration can be a good thing, a positive thing. You know, I've lived in a couple different countries in my life, been an immigrant, but at some point, is it better to help rebuild, or the place people are fleeing from, to help, or once there's peace, once the conflict is over, because that's that's what's really going to help is getting them back on their feet,
Okay.
because no one wants to leave their homeland, right? People generally don't want to leave their land of their families, their ancestors. They're fleeing, but can we help set up programs to help rebuild?
Okay.
I think that might be a better thing to look forward to, or think to plan for starting now,
We
to get that ready.
sure. We
Can I
have
respond to that a little really
before
quick?
you do, I'll let you respond.
Sure.
But before you do,
Sure.
I just want to draw this back, right? We're going a little far afield, and I want to kind of rein it in a little bit to talk about DEI specifically. But I understand these are good questions. These are good things, and I'll let you respond to that. But after that, I want to rein it in a little bit. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to make sure that my argument isn't being misrepresented. I'm not saying that Harvard has a duty to admit them as Harvard students one for one in this hypothetical of that we're laying out here. I'm saying that Harvard has a responsibility to provide refuge for those people if the people outcrying the injustice claim have the argument, right? An injustice claim isn't just recognized without scrutiny. So if a collection of Palestinians came forward and said, this university, in this hypothetical using Harvard, directly contributed to the destruction of our university, and here is the proof, then you examine the proof, and then we come to the conclusion that, hey, we looked at the data, we can make these connections, we used independent sources to confirm, and they agree as well. And that's like, okay, what's the redress to that? And my argument is that not to accept them as Harvard students, but to use Harvard as an institution, as a vehicle for them to continue their education in a way so that their education was not disrupted in the first place. It's not making them Harvard students. It's using the institutions in a way, using the DEI framework of justice, of equity. And then, like, you can do all that rebuilding stuff, because the thing that I'm concerned about when it comes to equity and justice, an injustice claim requires argumentation. And it's not my job as an American descendant of slaves of making the injustice claim for other people. I'm using this as a hypothetical as just one example, which is why I presupposed that all this stuff was already proven when I went down this road.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying. I want to rein it in a little bit because we are running out of time. Okay, I want to respect everyone's time here. This will be the last question before we get to closing statements, and you guys can tell people where they can find you, because you guys have been wonderful guests. You are all awesome, and I love every single one of you. Yes, even you. Okay. The question at hand with DEI as it pertains to corporations specifically. Let's move it away from academia. Let's talk about corporations for this last little bit. We have seen things like NPR as a good example, I think, or perhaps even the ACLU as another good example, where we've had a DEI style or framework that exists within the corporation that is leading to tensions in the corporation, as well as outside political and cultural tensions because of their dirty laundry getting aired out in public. So NPR specifically has had recently a spat. What is this gentleman's name? Uri. Let me get his name exactly. I have it up here. Uri Berliner recently wrote an article called "I've been at NPR for 25 years. Here's how we lost America's trust." He's also been the target of animosity in NPR. NPR employees, 50 of them, recently released a letter condemning Uri and asking the CEO of NPR, the head of NPR, I'm not sure the exact term to use, to specifically punish his and to set up a framework to punish and to censor his words. One, do we think this even relates to DEI at all? That's the claim being made out in the public. Or do we think this is just another cultural war bullshit? Do we think there's any heft to this? Is this a cause of worthy of concern, or is this people just playing politics? I know it's not the strict topic here, but it is, I think, related. So we're going to use this as the last question. Just quickly as you can, and then we'll wrap it up. Go ahead. Open to the floor. What do we think?
I think that it's taking from DEI, but I don't think this is directly involved with DEI. I think that's kind of like what I was talking about before, where they kind of use it as a catch-all term in this case. I haven't read what that guy wrote, but I think NPR is really not making itself look good between the CEO and how I think they suspended him from his job. So I just think they've been making a multitude of mistakes in this level, and the press and PR that they're getting now, ironically, is not great. So I think it's stupid. I think it's something that people can point to and say, oh, look, this is EI bad, in a way where it's harmful, to, as we were discussing the whole time, how there are positives to it. And so I think this is where things get lost. People point to this as another example of DEI gone rogue. I think that the CEO at NPR right now has their tweets resurfaced from her in the past showing like how leftist or progressive she is and her views. And I think that when people in power are at that position, I think it is harmful. I think that when you become a CEO, you have to be as objective as possible. You're running a company. It's about how the company can grow. And we know that DEI is not bad for company growth and inclusion. But I think when you overuse that, and then have turned on a journalist of yours who didn't write anything I thought abhorrent, and again, I didn't read the whole thing, but I just think that it's a bad look. But I think as a whole, I don't know if this directly fits with DEI.
Okay, so just to let you know, one of the criticisms that Uri had of the company was a source directory that tracked everyone's stated race and gender identities. And they used it in their promotions, etc., and things like that. And
Yeah, see,
that is DEI, is it not?
it's DEI
Yeah,
gone
that's exactly it.
steroids, gone wrong, way too far and extreme, and borderline using the ideas and mentality behind Jim Crow to do an eye for an eye racism back. It's crazy, and it does the actual full movement injustice when people, and you could take any movement through history and find people co-opting those movements for personal gain through
Is that
Christianity.
it? Is this? Do you think that the people here are doing this for personal gain?
I watched a lot of prep on before I came in here. That's what even TYT is saying, that like we've noticed DEI is often a way for people of color to get the jobs that they want, and sometimes get the workforce that they want behind them as well. Maybe this person just didn't have the right politics. They didn't want them around anymore because they wanted more an echo chamber for whatever reason. Like there's a multitude of reasons. I don't think we have enough to really make a judge on it, but I feel like there's more to it than just DEI. I think there was
Alright.
an agenda there.
I want to hear
Wait,
from
just-
I
I want to hear from
understand.
Joe, and I want to hear from
Yeah.
David. Then we got to get to closings. So
Yeah, I'm super short. I think it's reasonable to say if you work for NPR, you should probably clear when you post other editorials, opinion pieces to other news sources and other news outlets. From what I understand about this story, he posted this op-ed without the permission to do so from NPR. And maybe you can make the argument that the reason why he did this is because maybe he felt that NPR was just going to say no. Maybe they were going to censor him before that came out. And I would say, let them do that. Let them do that to you to help your argument.
so they
Don't-
suspended him for, I believe, 5 days. But go ahead.
And he resigned as of 2 days. Yeah, 2 days ago, I think 2 days or yesterday.
Oh, did he? Oh, fair enough. I didn't see
yeah.
that, but okay, fair enough. It's an ongoing situation.
Yeah, and that's the part of it to me where it's like, if you believe that the institution that you're in, because NPR is an institution, is moving in a way that is suppressing opinion, suppressing viewpoints, then ask NPR permission to post the very criticism you have to the company on their website, which they've done in the past. They've allowed journalists to have open criticism of the network on air, and they're also transparent about situations when there are competing interests, which is why sometimes when they have stories, especially when it relates to Amazon, they disclose to the public that they also have, in part or otherwise, affiliation with Amazon, affiliation with Netflix, etc.
Speaking of disclosure, I put it in my titles and things like that, but I'll just tell everyone so they know. I do get a check from Progressive Victory. They're not paying for this content, but I do get money from them. So just so everyone knows, I
Me
consult
too.
with
Me
them. So it's a disclosure thing. But thank you for that, and I want to hear from David on this, and then we gotta go to closings. I hate to rush this, but yeah.
Real quick, I think that NPR doesn't really practice a whole lot of journalism these days. I think the last 30 years we've seen this movement of activism as journalism, where people are think that their job as a journalist is to be an activist, to represent a viewpoint. I was going to go into journalism myself, and when I interviewed, they said, "What kind of journalist do you want to be?" And they said, "No, do you want to be a neo-Marxist? Do you want to be a conservative? Do you want to be? You're going to get hired for your political viewpoint." And I think it's been 30 years of this, and NPR is one among many media institutions that has become very polarized and polarizing. And I would just like to end off in saying that quality of journalism is directly proportional to their level of objectivity. I'll just leave it at that. So.
Okay. Gang, this has been, I think, a very great discussion. Thank you to my guests who have been, I don't think we had any ad hominems tonight. I don't think we had a single name calling, and I have mixed feelings on that, right? I kind of like the fireworks, but I appreciate I appreciate
all
the
around.
adults conversation. It's refreshing. I enjoyed it. Thank you to my audience who has been wonderful tonight. Thank you for the donations from all the people who super chatted, all the people who've gift subbed. Gang, I can't do this for free. I need your money to help me put on a show for you. Gang, I do this almost every night. Man, look, you're investing in great content. We got some great shows coming up tonight. Or not tonight, I'm sorry. Tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Eastern, I've brought in a guest moderator, okay? I'm bringing in a guest moderator because I want to fight, okay? And we're going to be talking about maids, medical assistants in death, what that looks like, if it's good, if it's bad. Me and Fairy Queen are going to be debating two schmucks, okay, who are very pro-maids. I'm anti-maids. I don't like that stuff. So tune in tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern for that. Next week, we got a slew of guests coming on. We have Sociological Ali. Me and him are going to have a discussion on Islam, on Palestine, on Israel. It'll be fun. On Wednesday, we got Counterpoints from Counterpoints 40K coming on. We got Radhom. We're going to talk about female custodes, right? Has Games Workshop gone woke? Thursday, we got a great show where we talk with Eucharist, and then Friday, we're going to be talking harassment in games, and that's another sponsored panel. It's going to be great. But I want to give each and every one of these people an outro. Tell people where they can find you, how they can get a follow you, subscribe to whatever you got. Go on. We're going to start with Joe, and we're going to end with Tyler there. So, Joe, where can people find you? Go ahead.
I deeply appreciate the recognition that I have to drive 4 hours. So, oh no. Okay, I'm still here. So thanks again for having me. If you have any sort of like disagreements with what I said or have any questions, feel free to bring it up in Wick's Discord under #debate or general. Just feel free to tag me and I'll answer when I can. As you can see, like, I'm moving around a bunch of places, so I'll do what I can in terms of responding. Otherwise, you can find me on usually X and Twitch. The handle's the same, Joe Lewis with 2 O's. So JOOELEWIS. And I really appreciate the time. This was a good conversation. And I hope people, at the very least, if they disagreed, at least understood people's arguments. So thanks for that.
Oh, thank you, gang. Check him out. He's great. We love Joe here. Give him a follow, all that. David Craig.
I'm gonna pop off too, so have a good one, guys, okay?
Hey, goodbye. Yeah, good. Drive safe.
Yeah.
Thank you. You guys take care.
David, what you got?
Good group all around. Yeah, good group all around. Thanks, guys. For a great discussion. You can just find me being mouthy on Twitter every once in a while. Otherwise, I try to keep my head down. So, but glad to be invited. Had a good time.
I hope you did. Maybe we'll get you back someday. Thanks for coming. Check him out on Twitter, gang. Yeah, thank you. Next up,
Or X.
Castle.
Yeah, similar to David. Great discussion. I'll follow all you guys on your socials afterwards too. And big shout out. Thanks, Wick, again for inviting me onto this first panel. So really appreciate that. You can find me on Twitter as well at Castle CASSELL Guard YT. On YouTube at Castle, and then on Twitch, just Castle Guard. So I've been new to this stuff, been making some videos and streaming here and there, but yeah, hope to be on a panel in the future. I mostly talk about politics, sports, and the market. So if you're into that stuff, come on by sometime.
Thank you for being here, and yeah, we'll definitely reach out again. Give him a follow, gang. Give him a subscribe on his YouTube. Help him out. We love to bump other creators here and shoot them to the moon. So go on, give him some love. Last but certainly not least, Tyler.
Well, I mean, I thought we were giving closing statements. I think I proved that diversity, equity, and inclusion all on their own are all good things, the preponderance of the time. And DEI itself, we're only hearing about the bad examples, which are few and far between. Every few months, we get one company, one person. The rest of the time, it's perfectly fine, and it's helping out. We'll see the results in 20 years. So that all being said, you can check out Twitter or my YouTube, Average Debate Enjoy. You could check out Wick's post, but he didn't tag me in it. He just made up whatever name he wanted.
Was that not you? Oops.
No, that wasn't me.
Oh,
So
my bad.
that being said, my channel's kind of on a hiatus, but because I'm learning things like I have my niche. I'm learning how to edit. I'm learning how to script write. I'm going to start taking these things from 2-hour-long rants down to 40-minute concise videos. So I got to do some personal work before my channel will be putting out videos that I actually want to watch. But give me a follow if you want anyway.
Great. Gang, check him out. He's great. Sorry I mistagged you. We'll correct that. But for now, we're going to rate out. We're going to rate out, and I'm really important. Make sure you spam those emotes if you got them, and tell him that this is a hate raid. But for now, wait, bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.